So let's get started. Today, our presentation is all about the Neolithic Revolution. Again, my name is Patrick Lassiter. I've taught AP World History for quite some time now. You can find me online. And then, of course, make sure that you're following Fiveable at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, on the Fiveable website here. Make sure that you can get all the updates as the year goes on. We're going to be looking at the Neolithic Revolution, but we're going to start with what pre-agricultural society looked like and what it was doing. Then we're going to look at this agricultural Neolithic Revolution, this movement to farming, and talk about what that was and what it looked like. What did agricultural societies, early agricultural societies look like? What were the environmental consequences of agriculture? That's something that often comes up in AP World History. Now, you may be saying, well, that's not going to be on this test. Well, throughout the course, even post 1200, you're going to be asked a lot of questions about the environmental consequences of human development and colonization or agriculture or the Green Revolution. And so if you can get some of the ideas of what the consequences of agriculture are, even in the earliest days, it'll make sense for what you get later on, if you can understand that trend in history. The next thing that we'll look at then are the social consequences of agriculture. How did agriculture fundamentally change our societies? And then we will dip our toe and just talk about a couple of the core and foundational civilizations. We will also end tonight with a couple of practice questions. We have one that is a multiple choice, and then one that I whipped up that is a short answer question and has a little bit more of a modern connection. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk a little bit about our pre-agricultural society. So from the earliest days of human development, back when we had the very earliest Homo sapiens, 200,000 or so years ago, all the way up until about 10,000 years ago. So 90% or over 90% of human history, humans were hunter-gatherers. That was what we did. They hunted for food, or they gathered food from the surrounding environment. Oftentimes this led to nomadic bands of groups moving from place to place, following their food supplies around. And that was the standard of how humans lived. The hunting, foraging bands of humans gradually migrated out of their origins in East Africa, which you can see on this map, right about 200,000 or so years ago. They migrated from there to other regions of the world, to Eurasia, even down into Australia, and eventually to the Americas. And so as these societies moved from one location to another, they were doing so to find their food. And there was a lot of things about these hunter-gatherer societies that we're going to get into right now. First of all, was their ability to adapt. As they moved from one climate zone to another, and they, of course, over thousands of years, mind you, this wasn't overnight at all. You can see on this beautiful map, each of the numbers represents a certain number of thousands of years ago. People began to adapt to different climate zones, whether it was cooler climates, and they began to adapt their clothing or their technology to colder environments or more tropical environments. This is something that we kind of see as like a hallmark of our early agriculture or early hunter-gatherer societies. So they migrate across the earth. We see this was done on foot, or if we look in the regions of Southeast Asia, Oceania, into the Pacific, through maritime migration. But migration to the Americas was done predominantly on foot during the last ice age. So somewhere between 25,000 and 14,000 years ago, humans crossed from Asia into the Americas and then spread out from there. eventually being cut off at the end of the last ice age. There was some migration back and forth for a time, but in general, that's what we see as the migration pattern. Again, adapting as they went, adapting their technology and their cultures to those new climate regions. Another thing that we see in this adaptation was the importance of developing increasingly diverse tools, these technological developments. One of the most important of these was the development of fire, of course, that allowed humans to do a number of things. One, sterilize their food. It made cooked food easier to digest, which allowed for better brain development. Fire, of course, helped protect against predators. And it also allowed this adaptation to colder environments. People could go into these maybe cooler environments with megafauna, these very large animals you may have seen in picture books of mammoths and mastodons and the like. But they also adapted other tools to these environments. The use of tools for hunting, for example, very specialized tools. Depending on whether or not they were in a coastal region or along a river, they may have had specialized tools for fishing. And if they are in the savannas, they might have specialized tools for hunting big game from distance. And of course, we see examples of these things like knives, arrowheads, axes, sharp spears, and the like. Those are all examples of technological development that existed pre-agriculture. And of course, hunter-gatherers still do exist in our world. Not everybody moved to agriculture, and you may be familiar with something we're going to look at later, some work by the great anthropologist and historian Jared Diamond, who's written extensively about this. Your teacher may have even made you read Guns, Germs, and Steel, and so you might be familiar with that. One thing that we also see in these pre-agricultural societies are generally egalitarian social structures. In fact, in some places, we even see matrilineal lineages. So we see men and women much more equal in pre-agricultural societies. They typically lived in small groups. And those bands of people could be as a handful of people to a couple hundred people. And of course, they exchanged ideas and goods and technology with one another, as people were wont to do as they moved around from place to place. But the more egalitarian structure of these societies was because they were a little bit smaller. Men and women were much more equal in these societies because women were actually, as primary gatherers, were bringing in much more food. People were gathering more food than they were actually successfully hunting. And so everyone being involved in this production led to that, that term I keep using, egalitarian, more equal social structures pre-agriculture. So that is kind of the precursor to what this whole talk is supposed to be about, which is the Neolithic Revolution. But before I want to talk about that, I want to talk about this thing called pastoralism, which you might see in your reading or any information that you have, or your teachers may talk about. Pastoralism is sometimes seen as kind of a step in the direction of agriculture. Of course, the Neolithic Revolution is when people begin to domesticate plants and begin to farm, and that's what it's all about. Pastoral cultures were still nomadic, but often followed herds of animals from place to place, or had some domestication of animals. And that was kind of a bridge to the development of agriculture, and that is what we believe happened. Pastoralism developed in Afro-Eurasian grasslands. We will talk about some of the environmental effects of pastoralism a little bit later. But it is very likely that many people turned to pastoralism before farming, or that it might have been a bridge there. Pastoralism certainly led to more reliable food supplies, and then agriculture kind of completes that. So let's talk a little bit then about our agricultural beginnings. Finally, we're to the thing that you're here for, to learn about the Neolithic Revolution. So beginning about 10,000 years ago, which is kind of a nice round number. The Neolithic Revolution, also known as the Agricultural Revolution or the dawn of farming, whatever you want to call it, it led to the development of new and more complex economic and social systems for humans, for humanity. Now, why did this occur? There's a lot of kind of theories about what led to agriculture. It is most likely due to, as a response to climate change. So not the kind of climate change we're experiencing now, man-made climate change, but just a general warming of the earth, especially following the last ice age. So what this led to is, as Earth warmed, more permanent agricultural villages began to emerge as certain crops became staples in diets. Agriculture was likely discovered kind of accidentally. Humans who would migrate from one place to another, these nomadic groups may have come back to places they had been at the previous year and found the same crops would grow over and over again in that place. Perhaps, as some historians and anthropologists have put forward, they had spilled seeds in a location the year before, and when they came back, it had grown into plants, and they started making these connections and learning how to cultivate the same seeds year after year. And as they got better at it, they began to settle down and tend those crops. And that's really kind of how we see these first villages form. You can't just necessarily plant something and hope it's there the next year. It has to be tended, it has to be watered, it has to be weeded. And if you do that properly, then you can produce a very reliable amount of food year after year. And so these early agricultural villages first emerged in the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean, what we typically refer to as the Fertile Crescent, which you see here on this map. The first agriculture that we have record of was probably here in kind of central Anatolia or Asia Minor, the country of modern-day Turkey, or the modern-day country of Turkey. But it was in the Fertile Crescent, the region known as Mesopotamia and sort of the Egyptian Valley, that we see kind of the earliest sustained agriculture for humanity. And so these were some of our kind of early places that we see. But agriculture does emerge at different times in different places as an independent development. So it wasn't like agriculture develops in Mesopotamia and then spreads slowly to China and they catch on, and then somebody goes to the Americas and it catches on there. Each region developed agriculture on their own. This actually gives this next map, which might be a little small to see, but you could probably search it online. I think it's from Wikipedia. We see that at different times in history, different crops were developed. So in the region of the Fertile Crescent, they were growing stuff like rye, barley. In East Asia, they were growing millet and rice. In the Americas, agriculture comes a little bit later typically, but we see corn or maize, corn, beans, and squash as being kind of the three sisters, the staples of agricultural production. But overall, we see agriculture developing in Mesopotamia, that is the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Nile River Valley, the Yellow River Valley in China. We see agriculture emerging in sub-Saharan Africa, independently in Papua New Guinea, in the Indus River Valley of South Asia, in Mesoamerica, and in Andean South America. And so agriculture emerges at different times in all of those places independently. And from those kind of cradles of agriculture, it spreads to the surrounding regions. And people in each region, of course, domesticated whatever was locally available, right? So that's one of the things that's remarkable about the Columbian Exchange that you'll be learning about in your courses. That was the first time that we actually see some of these plants from one of our hemispheres, the Old World and the New World, coming together. But in Mesopotamia, as I was saying, wheat, rye, barley, the domestication of goats as an animal Africa, it was yams and cattle. In Southeast Asia, it was rice. In Mesoamerica, maize and corn, but no domesticated animals of any kind. In South America, it was potatoes, and the only domesticated animals being llamas and alpacas, who had much more limited use than what we see in Afro-Eurasia, with horses and camels and cattle and the dozens of animals domesticated there. So in these early agricultural communities, we see a sustained and reliable food supply. And I know I just gave you a million different examples. You don't have to know all of them, certainly. If you're watching and you're kind of freaking out a little bit and saying, well, what the heck is do I have to memorize all of these things? Certainly not. There will still be some crops that you will associate with different regions of the world throughout your studies. But certainly it's not something that needs to be memorized. You just need to have the general idea about agriculture. It gives you a really good foundation. The first agricultural societies these to develop really developed out of necessity. This image that you're going to see here is of Cattle Hayuk in Anatolia, which we actually had seen on the map a little ways back. So agricultural communities had to cooperate. And so you see these kind of small bands of hunter-gatherers starting to come together into maybe larger communities. They had to cooperate to clear land. They had to cooperate to get water to their crops. So we start to see the first stages of human cooperation, even creating maybe what we would consider a state projects of irrigation. Almost couldn't think of the word. Of course, that drastically affected the environment itself, but we will see that that's going to even impact how societies are set up. You have these small villages, then you have to protect your food supply. So that might mean getting together to build a storage house, or to have soldiers perhaps that might protect it from bands of hunter-gatherers that might come steal your food. After all, you're making food for people, but you're an easy target, especially if you're sitting still. So we do see the developments of these early agricultural societies as these groups of people start with this cooperation and start growing larger and larger. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So let's think about this new agriculture and think about the consequences of it, right? So human beings start to farm about 10,000 years ago. We get really, really good at it about 8,000 years ago, and we continue to get better at it even today. But what is the environmental cost of that, right? For example, humans who were hunter-gatherers lived off of whatever the land provided them. And this idea, we'll talk also about hunting and gathering and the environment in just a moment, but the idea was they could not outgrow the land, right? Whatever the land supported, that was the population they had. Well, how does that change when humans learn to tame their environment? Literally tame plants, domesticate animals, tame the world around them. Well, ultimately, what we see is that it affects the environment in a few ways. Number one, it affects environmental diversity, especially as humans get really good at selecting crops that produce a lot. And in fact, we see a decrease in the diversity of both plants and animals as humans select the ones to continue breeding. So let's say that you have several varieties of early corn, and humans continue to select the stuff that grows the fastest and produces the most kernels per acre, something along those lines. Well, as they do that and they stop, and these plants become reliant on humans planting them year after year, planting these seeds year after year, well, if those are not chosen anymore, well, then those go extinct, and these other plants are then selected unnaturally to continue. We also see with this image, an example of environmental impact is that humans also have to clear massive amounts of land to farm. And so, of course, that can affect diversity as humans were, in this case, in many cases, burning forests or tearing them down in order to create more farmland. And when that farmland was used up, they would do the same thing with the next swath of land. And that trend really continues over thousands of years and continues today. You may have been noticing in the news information about logging in the Amazon, or clearing of land for farming in the Congo regions of Africa. So those are some examples of environmental impacts that we see, at least with the beginnings of agriculture. Also, we know that with agriculture, we see human populations on the rise. And of course, that puts even more stress on the environment, because now you're not just supporting the humans that were here before, but more food equals more people. And thus we have further strains as more and more of the environment needs to be used. Of course, that's not just clearing land, but you could, when you have the damming of rivers or the changes in water flow for irrigation, it can lead to greater soil erosion, or it can lead to, as people settle down in one region, it could lead to more pollution of humans' environment. So that's something that we see pretty commonly with agriculture and the agricultural revolution. Now, I mentioned pastoralism a little bit ago, and if you remember, that's people not necessarily are not being completely hunter-gatherers, but domesticating animals and being, we might say, semi-nomadic as they move with animals from place to place. But that also had its own environmental effects, especially because overgrazing of land led to erosion, and that was seen in agricultural societies as well. But pastoral societies also reaped or caused some damage to the environment. So if we think about this from kind of this environmental perspective, well, was foraging, was hunting and gathering better for the environment? And there are a lot of arguments on both sides of this on this debate. For example, you might say, well, lower human populations meant less environmental impact. And that is certainly true. As human population has grown throughout history, we have put more and more pressure on our environment. And hunting and gathering typically dealt with much lower human populations. We're talking in the hundreds of thousands to low millions for most of human history. Well, certainly they were not going to be creating man-made climate change. However, that does not mean that hunter-gatherers necessarily did not have an impact on the environment. That's one thing that we know about humans through all time, is that we have put strains on our environment. For example, hunter-gatherers became very aware that they could use fire to burn down large forests. And we see this especially in places like Australia, where they would burn large areas of the forest, forcing animals either to escape the forest, so they're easy targets for hunting, or once the forest burns and they have burned up and died, people can go in and eat, their pre-cooked meal. So hunter-gatherers were not living in some kind of Eden where they were necessarily stewards in the environment. They were like agricultural or like farmers later on, using the environment in the best way they could. But one kind of continuity we see really throughout this course, whether it's the old AP course, AP World course, or the new AP World History Modern course, is that humans and our choices and our growing populations and our demand on the environment will lead to negative environmental consequences. And it's really not until the 20th century that, well, maybe a little bit before that, but certainly 20th and now in the 21st century, that righting some of those wrongs has become front and center. All right, so that kind of goes through the environmental consequences of agriculture. Hopefully I can step off my soapbox now, and we will talk about some of our social consequences. So let's talk about some demographic changes. When we think about demographics, we're thinking about population. changes, and that could be anything from, most often we think about where people are living. It's anything statistically related to population or particular groups within it. Where people are living, where they're migrating to, and certainly how many people we're talking about here. And the first major demographic change is that with the advent of farming, population is going to start its increase. And it might not, if you look at a population chart throughout human history up to the present day, it may not seem like it goes up that much, but farming really does allow for much larger societies, a much more stable food supply, as people are not moving from place to place. People can have more children. Women begin to have more children throughout a lifetime because agriculture is intense work. And so you need people to tend the crops and make society happen. But also you have that food to feed them. So it's kind of a positive feedback loop there. So the human populations certainly were on the rise. Communities became much larger overall. We even see the development of villages and then later cities in this agricultural society. And those cities will evolve into states and empires, etc. The second thing that we see happen is the specialization of labor. And what we mean by this is that in hunter-gatherer societies, everyone hunted and gathered. Maybe some did more hunting, some did more gathering, but everybody was responsible for the production of food. Everybody was responsible for the production of tools. Everybody was responsible for their community. When we get to agriculture, in the early agricultural days, everyone's responsible for farming. But what happens when agriculture becomes more reliable and we see the creation of larger food surpluses? Well, when we see people farming more food than we need, well, then not everybody needs to farm. There's two things that can happen. Your population can go up and meet how much food that you're creating, but then that population can produce even more food, and humans get really good at this. And so if not everybody needs to farm, they can do other jobs. And so this is what we call the specialization of labor. We see new groups of people, some who are perhaps warriors, some political leaders, some perhaps merchants and traders, artisans. We see those classes develop. And from that, we also see the development of a social hierarchy of elites coming about. Oftentimes, those elites perhaps may have been warriors, may have been people who were producing the most food and thus could share with other people, and then people owed them favors. And now all of a sudden, you have a king who can kind of make things happen. The elites may have developed from religious beliefs and religious practices associated with agriculture. So depending on the society, there's a lot of different things that could go into the development of different elites. But we do see that specialization of labor and the development of a hierarchy, as those different jobs, as they develop, are assigned different value in society. And given that farming is the thing that sets this all off, it's kind of interesting that in most societies, most of our civilizations, farmers occupied the bottom rung of society. Oftentimes, right there is the lowest social class. And whether, the argument could be, well, most people were farmers. Almost everybody was farmers, so it was the most common job. It's maybe not as valued as much if everybody can do it. There is one exception to that, and that is in China, where for most of Chinese history, peasant farmers were considered, at least in the kind of official Confucian hierarchy, as one of the highest rungs of society, just below the bureaucrats, the educated bureaucrats. However, what it was perhaps in the way of thinking versus how it was in actuality, those don't necessarily always match up. So we do see farmers typically struggling and not being kind of the rich elite in these societies. Another thing that we see come out of agriculture, and I'd skipped over this, which you can see here, those technological innovations. So as people settled down in agriculture and started to see that they had new demands, new needs for their society, their new technology comes about. Things like pottery, which could help store grain for longer periods of time. The development of plows, which allowed humans to have animals, pull this device that would break up the soil much more efficiently, and then, of course, allow humans to plant more food, which will lead to growing populations. Woven textiles, wheeled vehicles, right, become invented. And then as people begin to farm, they also begin to experiment with metallurgy. And instead of just using wood and stone, right, from the Paleolithic era, pre-agricultural or old Stone Age, we see this Neolithic, new Stone Age, where people begin using bronze. And then they begin using, eventually with the Hittites, iron. And that will become a major development. And a lot of those developments are made possible because of that specialization of labor that comes when humans start producing more food than we need. If you're not constantly thinking about where your next meal comes from or how you're going to get your food or where you need to move to get it, you have a lot of time to do some other things. And so, we see that technological innovation begin to happen and puts us on the path, of course, to today. The last of these social consequences that I really want to talk about is the development of patriarchy. This is a term that you'll hear a lot in your course, not just in the old course, but in the AP World Modern course. It comes to define much of society across the world, especially agricultural civilizations. And so patriarchy is a system of social or government organization in which men hold most of the power and women are largely excluded from decision-making in that society. Now, there are certainly exceptions to this in all civilizations. However, patriarchal forms of social organization will develop in both pastoralist and agrarian societies and come to dominate social structures. It means that men are going to be seen as the leaders of these societies, and women will be relegated to a lesser and lesser role in general. Of course, we're making generalizations and thinking about trends in history. Now, how does agriculture lead to that? We may just want to kind of think through that one. How does agriculture lead to pastoralism? Well, we mentioned that populations were rising. And so as more food was available, people were having more children. As women had children, that's 40 weeks of carrying a child. As you get closer and closer to birth, women are often taken out of the food production role or out of other perhaps labor sources. And so men would continue to do those jobs as women are raising children and staying in the home rather than being out in the public sphere. Perhaps they were seen as less valuable to the creation of to the society as a whole. So there's a lot of ways that this connects. A lot of time, very much associated with food production. Remember, in hunter-gatherer societies, and it's sad, but it seems to be true. Women were gathering more than half the food, and we had more equal society. When women are taken out of that food production, whether that's having children or doing work within the home, or perhaps their jobs not being as valued as much as male warriors or religious leaders, they're sort of become left out. And patriarchy, of course, persists until today. It's a consequence of the development of agriculture. All right. So from there, I want to just talk a little bit about the first civilizations, right? Because agriculture leads to a fundamental restructuring of society. The first agricultural villages and then cities. Well, civilization itself comes from the same root as city, right? So the development of cities and what goes along with them creates what we deem to be this thing called civilization. It's really where we see our major developments come along. And the places where we see civilization, or the hallmarks of civilization, develop first also happen to be some of the first areas where agriculture develops. So take a look at this map here that you have in front of you, and it gives you the beginnings of civilization, and depending different times and different places when agriculture develops and the hallmarks of civilization develop. So just kind of look around here and see what we have, and we'll go over some examples as I get a drink here. So there are in the AP World Course, as it previously was, I think it's something like 8 different what we call core and foundational civilizations, which you see in the Middle East along the Tigris and Euphrates is Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamian civilization, Egyptian civilization along the Nile River Valley, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus River Valley, along the Indus River in present-day Pakistan. In China, we see Shang civilization developing along the Yellow River. And in the Americas, Olmec culture of Mesoamerica and the Chevan civilization of South America. Those are kind of our beginnings of civilization. And from there, we see other civilizations come about. In Mesoamerica, the Mayans and the Aztecs, for example. In South America, the Inca eventually, right? But those civilizations were not the first in those regions. They're just foundational. Society in India and China, you'll be studying a lot about how that developed, certainly in the Middle East, Egypt. And so you see a few more of these kind of cradles of civilization, so to speak. The 4 major river valley civilizations, though, are the Nile River Valley, Egypt, Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, India in the Indus River Valley, and China along the Yellow River Valley. So those are kind of 4 that you might be expected to know. The only thing really you had to know about these civilizations in the old course was just where they were located, and know that they developed, these civilizations developed in regions where agriculture flourished, typically in regions along rivers, though as with the Olmec and Chevan, not exclusively along rivers, but typically near water sources that enabled for better agriculture and better irrigated agriculture. So just kind of think about those things. Now, civilization, there are certain hallmarks for civilization that you're typically given. I didn't list them here in this presentation. One, because I don't want to kind of bog your mind down with these things as we get into the course, right? This is just supposed to be some background information for you. So these are things that I might have used to require my class to know, but no longer. But they certainly, agriculture is connected to these things. For example, when we see people begin to settle down in these communities, which will become cities, there were certain needs that had to be met. For example, if you're going to be settling down in one place in an easy sitting duck, you might have to have certain urban planning, right? Streets and roads, water, sewage, where the farmland's going to be, where the grain storage is going to be. Perhaps if you feel that you're in danger because you have large amounts of food that people might come and attack you for, you might need defensive walls, right? So urban planning was kind of a cultural development that comes along with civilization and farming. Also record keeping or writing, which is a really super important thing for the development of humanity and for communication. You see some examples of writing here, cuneiform in this clay tablet here, hieroglyphs from Egypt here in stone, but they also were written on papyrus or paper made of reed. And then here even a very different form of record keeping, which is quipu, which was common in the Andean region of South America, especially among the Inca, which was a system of knot tying to record statistical data. Now, writing itself was developed as a consequence of needing to keep records of agricultural production and trade. So you might have people paying a certain amount of bushels of wheat for, let's say, pottery that was created by an artisan. Well, those transactions need to be recorded somehow, or if you're trading animals for wheat, those you might want to keep track of those things. And so we start to see in many different societies, or in different societies, ways of recording that information. And then that recorded information starts to become more and more complex, and we even see systems of writing develop. And writing is one of those hallmarks of civilization as well, and certainly a major cultural consequence. Because if you're writing things down, now you can write down legal codes. Now you can codify religious beliefs. Of course, many early religious beliefs dealt with rituals alongside making agriculture happen, right? It was the duty of the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was this god figure, to go out and perform a ritual over the Nile River to make sure that it would flood every year at the same time. So that became very much tied together, religion and agriculture. And as we see some more of these cultural developments, we see religious beliefs becoming more complex, written down, codified. Certainly another cultural consequence of agriculture is trade. As some people are able to grow certain amounts of food, they might trade with pastoral or fully nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples, who can then take that food and perhaps trade it for goods being made elsewhere. There was interregional trade from Egypt into the region of Nubia to the south, between Egypt and Mesopotamia, between Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley. So we have a lot of examples of trade that came along with all of these other developments out of agriculture. Of course, social hierarchy is something that we would associate with civilization, right? That included patriarchy, and that intensified as cities and states and empires developed. And we already talked about how that was connected to agriculture. So lots of different things here. Monumental architecture, even, right? If we already connect religion and the codification of religious beliefs, well, we can connect that to monumental building plans, right? Whether it's building temples to conduct religious. I'm losing my words here. To conduct religious rituals, perhaps for farming, perhaps for other reasons, or it's just a monumental project to build a dam to help preserve water for irrigation purposes, or maybe even large irrigation systems, right? All of these things are enabled because humans were farming. All right. Where are we at now? Let's see. So that kind of brings us to the end of what I really want to talk about with the Neolithic Revolution. So if we go back to, that's the wrong slide. What we wanted to talk about today, we've talked about what pre-agricultural society looked like. We've talked about the Neolithic Revolution, this movement to farming, the beginning of farming in humanity. We've talked about what early agricultural society looks like. And what those environmental and social consequences are, and how it led to, briefly, how it led to the development of our, what we would call civilization. So these are hopefully something, if you have any more questions, certainly feel free to ask. Put it in the Ask a Question section, or put it in the chat, and we will make sure that we get to it. But I also want to give you some opportunities to practice. And so I have a couple questions here. The first one is a practice multiple choice question. And I do want to say off the bat that you will not see anything similar to this practice multiple choice question on your test, because it relates to pre-1200. Right, so it is actually outside the scope of the course, but it's always good, I think, to practice some of the skills. So when you get to a multiple choice question, especially if it has a reading attached to it, all of your multiple choice questions will have some sort of stimulus. I would say when you get there, you don't want to do the reading right away. Certainly not. So the first thing you need to do is look at your source information. So I get to a question, there's going to be a source with maybe 2 to 5 questions that go along with it. Here I see Jared Diamond, the guy I mentioned earlier, perhaps you're familiar with from Guns, Germs, and Steel. And this is an essay he wrote called Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race, and it came out in 1999. If you haven't read it in your class, you very likely still might. It's one of the more famous essays in the AP world community. So I know what this is. It's Worst Mistake. I might be familiar with it. You might not be familiar with it. And if you're not, that's okay. The next thing I want to do, though, is look at the question. Which of the following statements would the author of this source most likely agree? So we want to look through these and say, all right, which matches what he's saying in this source? So what I'm going to do is just give you a moment. We'll look through the source, talk about what he is saying, and see how that matches with what he would agree with. Would he agree that the Neolithic Revolution created more egalitarian societies as more food was available? Would he agree that agriculture was superior to foraging by giving people more leisure time to create art? That's attractive, right? We think agriculture is a step forward. The dawn of agriculture led to inequality across society that lasts to this day. We talked a little bit about that. And foraging societies were less healthy, but much happier than agricultural societies. Well, we haven't really talked about that at all. So we would have to see, well, what is he saying in this source? So I'm going to go ahead. We can go ahead and read it now. As for the claim that agriculture encouraged the flowering of art by providing us with leisure time, modern hunter-gatherers have at least as much free time as do farmers. The whole emphasis on leisure time as a critical factor seems to me misguided. Guerrillas have had ample free time to build their own Parthenon had they wanted to. While post-agricultural technological advances did make new art forms possible and preservation of art easier, great paintings and sculptures were already being produced by hunter-gatherers 15,000 years ago, and were still being produced as recently as the last century by hunter-gatherers, as some Eskimos and the Indians of the Pacific Northwest. Thus, with the advent of agriculture, an elite became better off, but most people became worse off. Instead of swallowing the progressivist party line that we chose agriculture because it was good for us, we must ask how we got trapped by it despite its pitfalls. So here in this essay, Jared Diamond is actually making the argument that perhaps agriculture was the worst mistake in human history. And what I will do in this is link to the to this article for you, which is freely available online. If you go and just search worst mistake in human history, you will definitely see this essay. But let's get back to the question, right? So what would he agree with? Would he agree with A, the Neolithic Revolution created more egalitarian societies since more food was available? Well, he actually says here at the bottom, most people became worse off and the elite became better off. And what we know about the Neolithic Revolution is that we see more social hierarchy develop. So we can cross out A. So what about B here? Agriculture was superior to foraging by giving people more leisure time to create art. Well, he does say that, there was art created, but he also says that hunter-gatherers have at least as much free time as do farmers. So because of that, there's not technically more free time. And in fact, later in a different part of the article, he makes the argument that hunter-gatherers probably had more free time in general. So we cross out B. So we're down to C and D already. 50% shot. If you're running out of time, you can take a guess and you'd be good to go. But the dawn of agriculture led to inequality across society that lasts to this day. Well, he does talk about these elite becoming better off. So he probably would agree with that, that the dawn of agriculture led to inequality, this social stratification. Foraging societies were less healthy, but much happier than agricultural societies. From what we have here, we can't determine that he would agree with that statement. And so that's one thing I do want to point out. This last one, we just don't have enough information to tell us. Now, in a different part of the article, he actually does say that foragers were probably more healthier than early agriculturalists because they had a more diverse diet, but we don't know that here. If we did know that, this would still be something he would disagree with. but we just can't choose it as the answer because we don't have enough information. So what that leads us to is the answer being C. So if you chose C, congratulations, you got this one correct. Now here's a practice SAQ question. Now the SAQ, or short answer question for the AP exam, will be, you have 4 questions, of which you'll only answer 3. The first question will have a secondary source that you will use to help answer a 3-part question. The second one will use a primary source that will help you answer a 3-part question. And then questions 3 and 4, and you have to answer 1 and 2. Questions 3 and 4 will look more like this. Question 3 will be from the first part of the modern course. Question 4 will be from the second part of the modern course. And it will have no stimulus at all. You will just be asked to pull information from your head. However, you get to answer the one that you know best. So what I did with this question is try to build not just what the question may have looked like when this topic was on the AP exam, but also make a modern connection here. So you would have to answer all parts of the question. First, identify one way in which the Neolithic Revolution impacted the environment. So when you're asked to identify, all you have to do is say, what was the way the environment was impacted? And you don't have to fully explain how or why, like you would for describe and explain, but you just have to tell one way in which it impacted the environment. So you could say that the Neolithic Revolution, or the dawn of agriculture, led to greater deforestation as people burned swaths of forest to plant crops. Or you could say it led to greater erosion of the soil as people used up soil, or anything along those lines. Or it decreased diversity of crops due to people selecting crops that they thought were best. So that's all you would have to do for A. And you don't have to go into the explain because all it says is identify. B, describe one social change that resulted from the Neolithic Revolution. And this you would have to give more detail on. So if you wanted to say one social change was that the Neolithic Revolution led to a, you can see I wrote this question, but I didn't think through the answers. It led to a, oh gosh, what was the term we used earlier? This is where I need people to put stuff in the chat for us. The Neolithic Revolution led to I'm gonna cheat here. I'm gonna go back to what we said earlier. I guess I'm on the wrong slides. It's when people, live TV, specialized labor, specialization of labor. That's what I'm thinking of. Whew, thanks for sticking with me, guys. So this one social change that resulted. Specialization of labor led to people doing more diverse work, perhaps. So you could say, well, that's a big social change, or social hierarchy we could even take too. But you can't just say that one change here because we're not identifying. You have to explain what that change is and how it's connected to the Neolithic Revolution. So you would have to say that specialization of labor occurred as people were not just farming anymore, as people started to do more specialized work. And you might want to give specific historical examples. You could say they became artisans and made things like pottery, or they became warriors and began defending territory. But then you have to make that connection, right? Describe how that change resulted from the Neolithic Revolution. The development of specialization of labor into classes of warriors, for example, may have been to protect food supplies in these sedentary communities from outside communities, right? So you have to give a little bit more. Oftentimes we say ace these questions. Answer the question, cite evidence, and then explain. And C is an explain. Explain one similarity the Green Revolution of the 20th century shares with the Neolithic Revolution. And so this would require you to know a little bit more information about the Green Revolution. So when you get to the end of your modern course and you get up to the 20th century, you're going to be learning a lot about that. So make sure that you come back and for those videos. One thing that we could talk about are demographic changes with the Neolithic Revolution. And again, you have to explain how it connects, how or why. for explain. The Neolithic Revolution, we saw a rise in population as more food was produced. Likewise, the Green Revolution of the 20th century led to massive increases in food supply with the development of GMOs and new agricultural technology. And in both cases, you could say, it led to increased stresses on our environment. So that would be an example of an SAQ, pretty short and to the point of what you write. You could probably answer that in half a page to 3/4 of a page. So those are some examples of what you might see asked on the test. Obviously, you're not going to necessarily have this topic. It's more of a foundational topic for you. But hopefully, seeing some practice questions and doing those practice questions will help you be familiar with the type of stuff that you might be asked on the AP exam.